My name is Myles, and today we're going to be looking at a walkthrough of how to use the GHAlex LUT. So in my last video I showed a bunch of examples of what the LUT was doing, and today we're going to show how I got there and how we can take that a little bit further and improve it. I'll be going through what you need to know before you start shooting, the camera settings you'll need to be thinking about, how to shoot for it when you're actually on set, and we'll look at the workflow in post. So to start off, let's have a look at this overview here. Down the left hand side we can see whether you'll be shooting in low light, whether it's a high frame rate, or if it's any other scenario. And if you're shooting in those conditions, that will determine things like your exposure method, even which LUT that you'll actually use in post. For example, if we take the low light situation, you'll want to expose moderately, and I'll explain what that means. The format that I'm recommending is a 10-bit Cine D. Now that's not given by the creator in the PDF, that's just my own opinion based on having some overly noisy vlog footage in the past. And in that situation you should be able to use any of the LUTs, the main, linear, soft or log C options. The next thing to consider is whether you'll be shooting a high frame rate, so I call that above 60p. Now in that scenario it's actually advised that you expose to the right. It's actually recommended you use Cine D profile, and also in post, because you've exposed to the right, you want to be using the linear GHAlex variant. It's also recommended that you stay at a max of 120p. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that's based for NTSC/American users, and that everyone in the PAL region can probably get away with up to 125p. That's where it's going to perform the best, below 125p. For every other scenario, you'll be shooting with a moderate exposure in any of the formats that you like, although I recommend Vlog just because that's where the developer started from. And again, you'll be able to use any of the main soft or linear variants. I'd just say that if you can use 10-bit, then I would do that, just because if you've got to correct anything in post, such as your white balance, 10-bit's going to be a bit more forgiving. For the settings, obviously you want to refer to the PDF supplied for the absolute optimum settings. It's noted in there that the LUT will perform best at ISO 400 for Vlog, 200 for Cine D, and they suggest as well using a specific ND filter, 2 Tiffin filters, all intra formats and certain luminance levels, but honestly I've not been doing exactly those things if I'm honest. So I've been going well over those ISOs myself when I need to. If you have all that gear and you're happy shooting like that, then by all means go for it. Don't worry too much if you don't stick to every specific rule in there. So in addition to the settings given, I would look at the zebras that you're using. I would set zebra 1 at 100%, and that'll be used obviously to make sure that nothing is blown out. And I would set zebra 2 at 60%, and I'll explain why later. You'll be flipping between the zebras, so I'd advise you actually assign the zebra toggle to one of the buttons. As always, you'll be able to do that just by holding the button itself down, and then the GH5 will ask you which menu option you want to assign to it. And lastly, for settings, if you're a Vlog user, you'll probably want to add the VLT, the monitoring LUT, to your GH5. So you add the file to the SD card, slot in your SD card to the camera, then you're going into the log monitoring menu item. You're going to load that LUT off the SD card, and then you'll be able to pick it for future. So before the shoot, you've already considered whether you'll be shooting in low light or a high frame rate situation. In order to take that into account, you've got your camera settings dialed in. So when you turn up on set, you need to make sure you nail the white balance and the exposure. It's going to make your life much easier if you can get those two things right. So as far as a workflow goes, I would first set white balance. The best way to do that obviously is using a grey card and then setting the white balance manually in camera. If you're not able to do that but you're using lights and you know their Kelvin value, you can dial in the exact Kelvin value into the camera. Or failing both of those things, I would recommend you pick the closest preset possible. Just don't use the auto white balance because there's no way to lock it in. If you're using auto white balance, the camera can just decide to change the white balance as and when it wants, and that could create a real big headache in post. If you aren't able to get really accurate white balance, 10-bit footage will be the kindest fix. It'll just hold up better than the 8-bit if you start pushing it around too much in post. So you've got your white balance, next you need to look at the exposure. Now earlier on I was referring to moderate exposure. I'd recommend you get that moderate exposure using a middle grey card, and you'll be making sure that the middle grey card appears on the waveform monitor in your GH5 at these values according to whichever profile you're using. So if you're shooting Cine D and it's not slow motion, then you'll be wanting an IRE value of 36 on the waveform. Obviously if you're shooting a high frame rate, you're exposing to the right and these go out the window. So if you're in an interview setting and your subject is under fixed lighting and is not moving, this is definitely the way you want to go. Put that grey card up to where their face will be and make sure you've got the right white balance and exposure for that region. I recommend you get one, but if you haven't got a grey card or your subject and lighting is moving around uncontrollably, then you could use the skin tone ranges that are also given. In CineD it's advised you keep skin between 28 and 57, Vlog between 40 and 60, and HLG between 26 and 55. Now those are the values given by the LUT creator, but honestly personally I wouldn't just follow those blindly. I'd want to keep an eye on what in the scene is overblown and make sure that nothing important is at that level, whilst keeping the skin tones in these ranges if possible. If you're anything like me and you're thinking, I could probably do long division in Chinese before I could pick out 28 on a GH5 waveform, then that's where the zebras come into use. The waveform on the GH5 is tiny, it's not numbered and it's not the clearest to read, so to pick out 28, 57 or even 55 is quite difficult. If you're using the skin tones method, you're probably going to want to get quite close up to your talent so that you can see their skin tone clearly on the waveform, otherwise the skin tones could just be lost in a sea of information. Alternatively, you can use zebras. So if you remember, we set zebra 2 as your max skin tone of 60. Now I know CineD goes to 57 and not 60, and HLG goes to 55 and not 60, but honestly I wouldn't worry too much about those. Zebra 2 being at 60, you're starting with a bright exposure and you're bringing that down until the zebras disappear on the skin tones, then you know you're within this range. I'd then flip back to Zebra 1 to make sure nothing critical was 100% and blown out. And if you're shooting in Vlog, obviously the blowout level is at 80%, but luckily the camera automatically cuts the 100% Zebra to 80%, so it still shows you what's overexposed. So at this point you've set your white balance, you've set your exposure. I would save that to a custom profile. Even though conditions might change throughout the shoot, if you accidentally turn the camera off, it'll be good to be able to turn it back on and be pretty close to where you were. And lastly, if you are in changing conditions, you want to adjust the exposure and potentially the white balance if you think that's changing. And I would just keep getting shots of the grey card snuck in there so that in post you've got that grey card to refer back to. Now here's a quick preview of the process we're about to go through. Now these are based on the process given in the PDF given with the LUTs, but I'm going to come at this from a Final Cut Pro angle and just show you how I would approach this. So welcome to Final Cut Pro. For all you Premiere Pro users, this is what an optimized editor looks like. I'm just joking, don't flame me in the comments. I do use both Premiere Pro and Final Cut, but honestly with there not being any specific instructions for Final Cut, I'm going to go through those for this video. So my first tip from Final Cut Pro users is not to use adjustment layers. So if like me you worship at the altar of the Final Cut god that is Ryan Nangle, and you've got his adjustment layers, they're not going to work for this process, and I'll just show you a quick example. So in this clip I've got my GHAlex and several adjustments around it, 4 in total, and in these adjustment layers over this clip I've got each of those changes independently in the same order as well. So I've got color curves there, and this one's going to have a LUT on it, and this one will have the GHAlex LUT on it as well. Now look at the difference between these two. Even though they've got the same changes, this is where the changes have been applied to the clip, and this is what it looks like when the changes have been applied to the layers, and you can see the difference in the waveform there. It just doesn't work. So my advice is to grade these clip by clip, and obviously you can copy and paste your changes between the clips. Alright, let's have an attempt at grading this clip. Now I'm not going to pretend that this is going to end up in a perfect result, but I'm just going to show you my approach. So the first step is to get the white balance right, and hopefully you'll have done that in camera. But if like me on this particular shoot, the sun was going in and out of clouds, the exposure and the white balance was changing, so it makes sense to check. Now if you've got a grey card shot, obviously you would white balance from the grey card, but otherwise I'm going to use this wall here and pretend that this should be white. Now your temptation might be to use Final Cut Pro's auto white balance, but that's actually changing exposure as well as the white balance, so it's recommended that you don't use that feature. Instead, we're going to mask out the area that we think should be pure white, and then have a look at that in the vector scope to make sure it's good. So let's mask out this bit of wall here. And we can see it is leaning down to this green side here, but overall it's not too bad. So to correct that, I will add color wheel effect, and I'm going to add a bit of magenta, bring that back to central. That looks good to me. Take the mask back off, and in the next step I describe having to change the exposure if it's significantly over or underexposed, and we can see this clip is very overexposed. Nothing's clipping too harshly in these highlights, but it is clearly an overexposed image, so exposing to the right for this shot. So for this next step I'm going to try apply a smoothish curve to bring this down to normal levels. We'll attack the highlights first, So something like that. We can see the shadows are much closer to 0 now, the midtones are close to the middle of the range, and we've got only the highlights in this top area here. The next step is to apply a color space transformation if you didn't shoot in log, and this was shot in sinha, so I do need to do that. You're advised to use the Final Cut Pro's inbuilt custom LUT utility for that. I know there's a Motion VFX M LUT that a lot of people use, but that apparently causes issues. So you want to first apply your sinha to Vlog transformation in this custom LUT here. Next we want to apply the GHAlex LUT. Now because this was overexposed, I'm restricted here to using the linear one, which apparently will give us the best results. Now the next step in my workflow was to review the changes that you made in advance of the LUTs. So the LUTs are very particular and very sensitive to white balance and exposure. They're expecting good white balance and moderate exposure. Anything other than that and you'll get a weird result that looks like this. Obviously we've got highlights here which are in the roll off section. That's why you'll lose detail and lose color. Don't forget the LUTs are applying a highlight shoulder in about this region. So anything that you feed it within there is going to come out looking like this. So that's why it's important when the exposure is not right that it's corrected before the LUT. You've got to remember the order of operations that Final Cut is going through. It's going through these changes from top to bottom. So first applying the white balance change, then I applied the exposure changes there, then the LUTs have kicked in and made the rest of the changes. If I just move this exposure change, for example, after the LUTs, you can see how we've lost all saturation there and detail is lost and it doesn't look great at all. So that's why it's really important to remember the steps in this workflow order. And at this point, if you see any weird sort of goings on in the image, you can go back to the steps before the LUTs were applied and make changes so that it looks less weird. So now that we've got decent exposure fed into the LUTs themselves, they've done the transformation, and now we go on to the step which is called Place Luma. What I think they mean by that is to get your exposure levels into the zones which define a cinematic look. Now personally I describe this as grading. You've already applied the GHAlex LUTs and you've got their conversions. The rest of it is just going to be good practice. So personally at this stage I would mask out my skin tones so that we can evaluate where they are in terms of exposure and where they are on the vector scope. I'm just going to use this piece of leg here. It's a nice big chunk of skin. Got a range of highlight and shadow, and we can see they go up to about 52, 53, something like that. And also when it comes to the vector scope, you can see they are just lying on the right hand side of the skin tone line, which suggests they're a bit pinky red. Now just a word on the skin tones. The feedback given from my last video where I reviewed the LUT and from people that also use the LUT is that they find their skin tones can be a bit red pink. Now some people actually like that look. If you look at DSLR video shooters page, for example, he's now using the GHAlex LUT to grade his footage, and I think I see the red pinkness in there left uncorrected. But let's say for example you weren't happy and you wanted to change it. Well, first of all I would review your exposure and white balance because they are going to lead to issues in the skin tones if they're not exactly right. For the sake of an example, say you're not happy with the pinkness of this skin tone, let's look at how I'd change that. So I'd go back to my mask. I'd first of all change the exposure because technically that's probably a little overexposed. So I'll apply another curve to bring that down as smoothly as possible, as always. Just one there because that's about halfway zone. So something like that brings it to below 50, but probably not quite in line with the specified guidelines. But that'll do me, I wanted quite a bright look anyway. Let's have a look at what that looks like now. And obviously because we've made the colours deeper, that's impacted the saturation on the skin tones. So let's work with those skin tones. I'll put my mask back on, and in Final Cut you want to use the hue saturation curves. So if you're finding they're a bit too red pink, what you can do is you can do a hue versus hue change. So you can select your eyedropper, select a piece of the pink skin, and dragging it down will take it towards the green scale and remove a bit of that pink. So I won't do that too much, but I'll go about there. Also because we impacted the saturation, I'm probably going to do the same and bring that down a touch. Something like that. And from here it all just comes down to personal preference. So you've seen the tool there where you can isolate skin tones and make them more yellow, take out the redness. You could do the same with saturation, or perhaps you even wanted the skin tones to be a bit brighter, just use the eyedropper there and the Luma, and you've isolated the skin tones to make them a bit brighter, or a bit darker as you need. Now the last step given in my workflow is blur ? So that comes from the PDF where they give detailed instructions on how to apply a blur layer in DaVinci Resolve and Premiere Pro. And I suppose that's designed to take the sharpness off the video and make it look less video-ish. It'll also probably have an impact on the highlight roll-off. I've never personally needed to go further than the LUT myself to attack that, but if you did want to play around with that, I would suggest copying your footage into the layer above by holding Alt and dragging that out, applying your Gaussian blur to that layer, bringing the opacity of the layer down to maybe 20%, which is recommended in there, and then adjusting the Gaussian blur as appropriate. Can't give you any official guidelines on that because I've never wanted to use that myself, so it'll be trial and error if you even want to go down that route. From there you can add other LUTs, play around with the intensity of those, play around with your exposure, your contrast, saturation, and you should still retain the benefits of the GHAlex skin tones and the highlight roll off and get the creative look that you're after. Okay, the last example I just want to go through was an HLG shot. I did shoot this exposing to the right, but also this is what HLG looks like when you put it into a Rec 709 timeline. I won't go through all the steps again with this shot, but there are a few key differences for HLG I think you need to know about. So applying the two LUTs again, one to convert it from HLG to Vlog and the other to apply the GHAlex LUT. And the important thing to look out for here is that the input has gone to Rec 2020 HLG and the output to Rec 709 on this HLG to Vlog LUT. That's key. If it didn't do that, your image would be wildly overexposed still, just looking like that. So make sure that's in order. And then in this case, as this was shot exposed to the right, I would add a color curve and also bring it to before the LUT itself. And I would go in and I want to bring down the top of the highlights so that they're a bit more pleasing. So that's already an improvement, but obviously you can adjust your curve however you like. The rest of the principles apply here, so I won't go into any more detail on that, just to show those two differences of maybe starting off at the very top instead of introducing a curve when it comes to bringing down the exposure, and also making sure that you've got this Rec 2022 HLG as the input part of this LUT. Alright, that's about everything I wanted to go through. Could you do me a favour and leave a comment to let me know if I've answered your questions? Let me know if you've got other questions. Let me know if it was any use or not. That'd be really helpful. Thanks a lot, and I'll see you in the next one.